Hector Vance laughed before she set the document on the counter. Not loud, the quiet kind. The kind that does not need volume to land, and does not ask permission, and does not apologize afterward. The people nearby heard it and understood exactly what it meant, without anyone having to explain. That was the moment Willa Carver understood what she was dealing with. Not a bank exercising its contractual rights. Something more deliberate than that. She had driven 4 hours from Lexington that morning with dried mud on her boot heels from walking the farm at dawn, a notebook with 7 questions written in careful order, and a photocopy of a document she did not yet fully understand. She had arrived at Ridgeline Savings Bank at 9 in the morning and waited 50 minutes at the front counter while other customers came and went, and the fluorescent lights hummed above her, and the room smelled of carpet cleaner and fresh coffee, and the particular neutrality of spaces designed to make certain kinds of conversations feel routine. When Hector finally appeared from the back hallway, he stopped at the lobby counter rather than his office. That was the first thing she noted. He stopped in the open where the acoustics carried where 3 or 4 customers could hear without difficulty. He addressed her as Miss Carver, in a tone that landed somewhere between condolence and conclusion. And he explained Cole's default and the property's decline value, and the estate's likely trajectory with the patient authority of a man who had delivered this kind of information many times, and had never once been required to deliver it to himself. Willa listened to all of it. Then she asked for complete copies of the mortgage file and all property documentation attached to the collateral schedule. That was when he laughed. He said a girl who had been sent away by her own father had no particular standing to come back now and claim expertise in land matters. He said Cole Carver had spent 30 years failing at the one thing he had chosen over his own family, and the kindest thing Willa could do was accept the voluntary transfer agreement and let the process close without additional expense to anyone. Then he said the thing that silenced the room. He said a person who had been discarded before she was old enough to choose otherwise had no business arriving now and pretending she was the one who had been selected to carry on. The lobby went quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of an empty space. The quiet of people who have just heard something they were not supposed to witness. Willa did not move. She held the strap of her bag and looked at Hector directly and asked him one question. She asked whether the collateral schedule included any separate listing for water rights or subsurface access rights attached to the north parcel. Hector answered immediately that attorney fees in estate disputes of this nature frequently exceeded the value of the asset under dispute. He did not answer her question, but before he turned away, Willa had already seen something she had not been meant to see. On the desk behind the counter, visible through the gap in the partition where Hector had come through, was an open file folder. The tab was printed, not handwritten. It read, Carver Estate. And below the tab on a cover sheet, she could read from 8 feet away because the font was large and the logo was distinctive, were the words, Prairie Vantage, LLC. The file already existed. It already had a cover sheet. It already had a corporate partner named on it. Cole Carver had been dead for 6 days. Willa put her notebook in her bag and walked out through the glass doors without a word. She did not go back to the farmhouse directly. She drove north on County Road 12 and pulled over on the gravel shoulder where the road ran alongside a harvested soybean field and sat looking out at the pale stubble and the flat October sky, and let what she had just seen arrange itself into the correct order in her mind. The bank had not begun working with Prairie Vantage after Cole died. They had been working with Prairie Vantage before the file was even officially opened. The cover sheet had not been prepared the morning she walked in. Cover sheets like that were prepared when a relationship was established, when an understanding had been reached, when 2 parties had agreed on the shape of a transaction and begun building the paperwork around it. Someone had decided what would happen to the Carver farm before Cole Carver was in the ground. She sat on the shoulder of that county road for 20 minutes and then drove back to the farm. Dunmore, Illinois was a town of 3,200 people with a long memory and a short list of categories for the people it contained. Willa had been assigned her category before she was old enough to contest it. She was the girl whose father had sent her to live with her aunt in Springfield at age 9, the year after her mother Elaine died of a cardiac condition that had been misdiagnosed twice and treated once too late. She was the girl who had left and stayed gone. She was the abandoned daughter who came back periodically as though belonging somewhere was a thing you could reclaim by showing up. She was 27 years old. She had worked for 6 years as an administrative assistant at a property law office in Lexington. Not as a paralegal, not as a legal clerk, but as the person who typed the documents and managed the filing system and answered the phones. And because she was the kind of person who read everything, placed in front of her with full attention, had absorbed more about how property instruments worked than anyone in that office had ever thought to credit her for. She was not a lawyer. She had no credential that entitled her to an opinion in a room full of people with credentials. What she had was the habit of attention and 18 years of practice at being underestimated. She had believed Cole's explanation for sending her away for a long time. He had told her aunt that the farm was too much to manage with a child underfoot. He had said it flatly in the way Cole said everything that was difficult, as though the words were objects he was setting down and not rooms he was opening. She had believed it. Then she had stopped believing it and started being angry instead. The anger had softened in her mid-20s into something quieter and more durable, a low, constant frequency of unanswered questions she had learned to work around rather than through. Cole had called her every Sunday without fail for 18 years. He asked about her week. He listened. He said a few words about the weather or the corn prices or the condition of the South field, and then said goodbye. She had answered every Sunday for 18 years because she had never been able to figure out how not to. The Carver farm sat at the end of a gravel lane that had not been maintained with any consistency in years. The ruts were deep, and the grass had moved in from both sides. The fence along the road leaned at angles that spoke of slow settling rather than sudden collapse. The cattle barn stood empty, its main door hanging on one hinge. The storage barn had a section of corrugated roof peeled back on the south side, where no one had been up to fix it. Travis Holt was standing by the storage barn when she pulled in. He was a broad man with a plain face and gray at his temples, wearing a canvas work coat he had owned since before Willa had left for Springfield. He had called her from a number she almost did not answer, and had said her name once, and then said her father was gone, and then waited without filling the silence, which was the right thing to do. Cole Carver had died of a stroke alone in the storage barn on a Tuesday morning. Travis had found him when he came by to return a socket set borrowed 6 weeks earlier. The paramedics said it was fast. Travis said he believed them because Cole had still been standing when he went down and had caught the edge of the workbench on his way, and the ceramic coffee mug on the floor beside him had not broken when it fell. Willa stood in the storage barn that first afternoon and looked at the mug for a long time. It was chipped at the rim with a faded co-op logo that had probably stopped being printed a decade ago. Cole had never discarded anything that still functioned. The mug still functioned. She told Travis what she had seen at the bank, not the laugh and not what Hector had said about her father choosing land over family, just the part that mattered operationally, the folder, the logo, the timeline. Travis set his pliers on the workbench and looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said Cole had mentioned the north parcel more than once in the last few years, not urgently, not in a way that had seemed to require a response. But he had said something once while they were replacing a belt on the old combine about water being worth more than the dirt above it, and about people in suits not knowing the difference between owning land and owning what the land was built on. Travis said he had not thought much of it at the time. It had sounded like the kind of observation Cole occasionally made, the kind that seemed like general wisdom and might or might not be connected to anything specific. Willa asked where Cole had kept his private papers. Travis walked her past the workbench and the sorted hardware bins to the grain trough along the east wall that had not been used since the cattle operation ended before Willa was born. He crouched and lifted 2 floorboards near the trough's base. They came up without resistance, the way boards come up when they have been lifted many times before, and replaced each time with care. The tin box was there. It was not large. Dark green paint worn to bare metal at the corners, hinges slightly stiff, not locked. Willa carried it to the workbench and opened it under the bare bulb overhead. Inside, kept without obvious order but with clear intention, were these things. A photograph of her mother, Elaine, standing in the corn in summer, her hand shading her eyes, smiling at whoever held the camera. A small brass key on a loop of cotton string. A hand-drawn map of the north parcel in pencil, the scale marked at the bottom in Cole's blocky handwriting, the northeast corner marked with a small square, and beneath it the notation AB 1971. A repair invoice from 1999 for a water pump on the north pasture. A sealed envelope with Willa's name on it, the letters formed with the careful pressure of a man who did not write often, but took it seriously when he did. And at the bottom, folded inside a sleeve of waxed paper, taped along both edges, a property deed. She opened the deed first. It was dated 1971. It recorded the purchase of 40 additional acres on the northern boundary of the Carver property from the family of a man named Gerald Odom. The legal description named the northern fence line a natural spring channel running east to west, and a point of access to an underground water table registered under the county's agricultural survey records from 1962. She read the main body twice. Then she found the attachment. It was headed Appendix B, a separate page executed at the same time as the primary deed but registered separately at the state level. Its language was specific and not difficult to understand once you slowed down and read each clause in full rather than skimming for the gist. The appendix established the water rights spring access and subsurface water table interest in the north, 40 acres as a separately constituted property interest. It stated explicitly that this interest could not be pledged, conveyed, or incorporated into any farm operating mortgage or general encumbrance without a separate written instrument identifying these rights by their registered description and executed with the same formality as the original deed. She read it 3 times. Then she opened the envelope. Cole had written the letter across what appeared to be 3 separate sessions. Lines were crossed out near the top. The handwriting changed in pressure between paragraphs, the way writing changes when a person sets it down and comes back to it days later, and is not in the same state of mind. He wrote that he had not sent her away because he did not love her. He wrote it plainly and without decoration, and moved directly to the next sentence without pausing to elaborate, because that was exactly how Cole would have handled the most significant statement he had ever committed to paper. He wrote that in the autumn of the year after Elaine died, he had begun to understand that someone had an interest in the north 40 acres that extended beyond what was visible. He had noticed a surveying crew on the county road at the north fence line twice in 6 weeks. He had asked at the co-op and been told the surveys were routine infrastructure assessment. He had known enough situations to recognize when a routine explanation was being supplied too quickly and too smoothly to be fully believed. He wrote that his father Earl had told him when Cole was in his 20s and Earl was getting old, that Appendix B was the most important piece of paper on the property, Earl had said the water under the north field was not a convenience but a resource, and that the day would come when someone with more lawyers than sense would try to absorb it through a financial instrument that did not name it directly, and that the only protection was the appendix existing separately and the family knowing it existed. Cole wrote that he had been afraid, not of losing the land in the abstract. He had been afraid for Willa, specifically a child still, and he had convinced himself that sending her to Springfield was a way of keeping her outside the edges of something he could feel building, but could not yet see clearly. He had been wrong about the method. He wrote those exact words. He had been wrong about the method, and he had understood that for most of the years since, and had not found the way to say it in a form that would undo any of the damage already done. He wrote that she should look at the north fence line at the corner post on the east side, and at what was carved into its base. He wrote that the appendix said everything the bank would not want said. He wrote that she had always been more careful than he deserved. Willa set the letter down. She stood in the storage barn, with the October wind pressing against the metal siding, and the smell of old motor oil and dry rope and something beneath all of it that might have been grain from before she was born, and she did not move for a long time. Then she picked the letter up and read it again. Not the part about the appendix, the other part. Travis had stepped outside to give her the room. When she came to the door, he was standing with his back to her, looking out at the north field with his hands in his coat pockets. She read him the relevant clause from the appendix. He listened without turning his head, which was how Travis listened to things that required his full attention. He said he knew the corner post she was looking for. Cole had told him 15 years ago that the post was not to be moved under any circumstance, not for a field rotation, not for a fence repair. He had said it once in the tone he reserved for things that did not need to be said more than once, and Travis had honored the instruction without fully understanding it until this moment. They spread the hand-drawn map on the hood of her truck in the gray afternoon light. The north parcel's boundaries were drawn with a second line slightly inset from the property edge. At the northeast corner was the small square notation, a B 1971, Appendix B 1971. Cole had left her a map to the document and a letter explaining what the document meant, and a tin box to keep both in. And he had placed the box under a floorboard in the one building on the property where Travis Holt came every week without being asked. Cole had not left things to chance. He had left things to her. That night, she spread the deed and the appendix and the bank's default notice and the collateral schedule summary she had photographed at the bank across the kitchen table under the light. Her mother had once stood beneath making coffee before the rest of the house was awake. She read each document against the others. She made notes in the margins of her notebook. She worked the way she had always worked, slowly and without shortcuts, reading each clause in full before moving to the next. The bank's mortgage documents described the collateral as the farm operating parcel outbuildings and equipment inventory. There was no language in the loan agreement that named water rights, no language that referenced the 1971 deed, no language that referenced Appendix B. Either the bank had not known the appendix existed, or the bank had known, and had structured the mortgage to exclude it deliberately, assuming the appendix would not be found in time to matter. Given the Prairie Vantage folder she had seen that morning, she had a clear sense of which explanation was more accurate. She wrote 6 questions in her notebook in the order they needed to be answered. She wrote them slowly, pressing the pen firmly into the paper, because writing things down was how she had always made them real. The first question was why the bank's collateral schedule contained no reference to the 1971 deed or its appendix when that document had been registered at the state level and should have appeared in any thorough title search. The second was whether the document had been misfiled or misclassified in the county's digitized records system. The third was whether any third party had accessed county property records related to the Carver North parcel before Cole's death. The fourth was whether the separately constituted water rights in Appendix B remained legally valid under Illinois property law. The fifth was whether Cole's loan had been structured in a way that someone understood would not capture the appendix rights, and whether that understanding had been deliberate. The sixth question she wrote, and then looked at for a long time before she closed the notebook. It was the one she could not answer with documents. It was whether her father had spent 18 years keeping her at a distance because he was protecting her, and whether the difference between protection and abandonment was something that could be determined from the evidence available to her, or whether it was the kind of question a tin box under a floorboard could only begin to address. She closed the notebook. Outside, the October wind moved through the dry corn on the south field with a low, continuous sound, like something being counted slowly in the dark. The kitchen light was on. The deed was on the table. Her name was on an envelope her father had sealed and kept for years, waiting for a return he had made certain she would eventually need to make. She was 27 years old, and she had mud on her boots from the farm where she had spent the first 9 years of her life, and she had a document that said something the bank had spent years trying to ensure would never be said. She made coffee and sat down and read the appendix one more time. She did not sleep well that first week. The farmhouse made sounds at night. She had forgotten the creak of the second step on the staircase, the kitchen window frame expanding and contracting in the cold, the distant grain elevator running its augers after midnight when the harvest trucks came in late. She lay in her old room under a wool blanket and worked through her 6 questions in the dark, turning each one over until she could see its edges clearly. By the 4th morning, she had a working theory. By the 6th morning, she had enough to make a phone call. Diane Oakes practiced property law out of a second-floor office above a title company in Lexington. 2 filing cabinets, a slow printer, 17 years of experience in Illinois agricultural land, matters, and a professional reputation built entirely on telling clients the truth about their cases, without adding optimism to soften the invoice. Willa had typed documents for her twice on contract work passed through the law office. She had found Diane precise and unhurried, and constitutionally unable to soften an assessment for the sake of the person receiving it. Those were exactly the qualities required. She called on a Thursday morning from the kitchen table, while Travis worked on a section of fence along the county road outside. She read Diane the relevant clause from Appendix B over the phone, the way she had read documents to attorneys before, slowly, and without summarizing, making sure each word was received rather than implied. Diane asked her to read it again. Willa read it again. Diane said she would need to see the original and the full mortgage file before she could say anything definitive. But she said the clause Willa had described, if it held up on examination, established a separately constituted property interest under pre-existing deed language and under Illinois precedent. A separately constituted interest of that kind could not be incorporated into farm operating mortgage collateral without an explicit written conveyance naming those rights by their registered description. She said there was an appellate ruling from 1993 in Sangamon County that addressed a situation with significant similarities. She said significant similarities was not the same as identical, and that Willa should not count anything until the original document had been examined. She also said that if what Willa was describing was accurate, the bank had either made a serious administrative error or had structured the mortgage in a way that assumed the appendix would not be found before the foreclosure concluded. Willa asked which Diane thought was more likely. Diane said she had been practicing property law in Illinois for 17 years, and in her experience, the answer to that question usually became clear when you looked at the timing of other people's paperwork. They agreed to meet in Lexington on Friday. Willa said she would bring everything. She went to the county records office the next morning. The Calhoun County Records Office occupied a low brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse. The digitization system had been installed 8 years ago with grant funding and maintained unevenly since. Ruth Odom worked the primary records desk, 55 years old. Dark blonde hair cut straight to her jaw. And when Willa came through the door, Ruth's posture shifted in a way that was small enough that most people would not have registered it. Willa registered it. She asked to search the registered deed records for the Carver North parcel, specifically any documents associated with a 1971 property transfer from the Odom family to Earl Carver. Ruth ran the search twice. Then she turned her chair slightly away from the screen and said the document appeared in the system under a classification of legacy business transaction rather than property transfer. That classification meant it would not surface in a standard ownership search run by parcel number or owner name. It would only appear if someone searched specifically by transaction type within the legacy category, a category used for commercial agreements and business contracts, not real estate conveyances. Willa asked when that classification had been assigned. Ruth said the digitization records showed it had been classified that way since initial data entry. She said the paper original in the archive room carried a different classification stamp, property transfer with subsurface covenant, the correct classification. Willa asked her to say that again. Ruth said it quietly and without elaboration. The paper original had the correct classification. The digital record had an incorrect one. Every title search conducted since the system went live had been pulling the digital record. Ruth went to the archive room and returned with the paper original and set it on the counter without comment and moved to the far end of the filing room. The paper original had the state-level registration seal in the upper right corner. It had the correct classification on the cover sheet. It had a handwritten margin note that read, "See Appendix B separately filed," followed by a filing number. Willa photographed everything. She called Diane from the farmhouse kitchen with the documents spread in front of her. She read her the classification discrepancy. She read her the margin note. Diane said she would move the meeting to Friday morning and to bring everything Willa had. Travis came by that afternoon and found her already in the north field with Cole's hand-drawn map and a pair of work gloves walking the fence line alone. He pulled up in his truck and climbed out without being asked, and they walked together to the northeast corner, pushing through overgrown grass and a section of fence that had been rebuilt at some point in the previous decade, with the new posts set slightly inside the original line. Willa had read the notation on Cole's map again that morning before she came out. She had read the letter again as well. Cole had written that she should stand at the northeast corner and look down. Not look around. Look down. She stopped at the base of the large cottonwood Cole had marked on the map with a small circle. The ground had built up with years of leaf matter and soil drift against the tree's roots. She crouched and began clearing the surface with her work gloves, pulling back the accumulated debris with both hands, working methodically outward from the base of the tree. Travis stood nearby and did not offer to help. He understood without being told that this was something she needed to do herself. The stone post was 8 inches below the surface, set deep in the ground granite, roughly squared. She cleared enough material to read the face. EC 1971. Earl Carver's initials and the year he had bought the North 40 and filed the appendix, and understood something about the future that most men in his position would not have thought to understand. Travis looked at it for a long time. He said Cole had told him that post was not to be moved or built over under any circumstance. He said Cole had mentioned it once in the way Cole mentioned everything that was permanent and non-negotiable, and Travis had assumed it was a survey marker and had never asked what it marked. He said he wished he had asked. Willa told him he had done exactly what Cole asked him to do. She said that had always been enough. They walked back to the trucks in the thinning afternoon light, and Willa understood something she had not allowed herself to understand until that moment. Cole had known this day was coming. He had not known when, but he had prepared for it with the patience of a man who understood that preparation and timing were the only resources he had available. He had maintained the stone post and sealed the tin box and written the letter and drawn the map and placed everything in the one location on the property where a reliable man would go every week without being asked. He had spent 18 years making sure she would be that person. He had spent 18 years making her ready for the 1 week that mattered. She drove to Diane's office Friday morning with the original deed and the appendix and the paper archive record and the photographic evidence of the classification discrepancy and Cole's hand-drawn map and the 6 questions from her notebook. Diane spread everything across her conference table and read for 45 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, she said 3 things. The appendix was valid and had been validly registered at the state level. The mortgage collateral schedule contained no language naming or incorporating the separately constituted water rights, and the classification discrepancy in the county digital system was not, in her professional judgment, the kind of error that occurred randomly. She said they needed one more thing before she could build a complete argument. They needed physical evidence that the water access described in the appendix remained viable on the land, because if the bank's position was that the water rights were non-functional and therefore without value, that argument required a technical counter. She gave Willa the name of Nolan Reed, a former county assessor, who had retired 4 years ago and who had kept physical copies of county survey maps and plat records not transferred to the digital system. 22 years in that office. He knew where every boundary line in Calhoun County had originally been drawn. She also told Willa to prepare for Hector to move quickly once he understood she was not going to sign the voluntary transfer. Men who operated the way Hector operated did not wait once they recognized the clock was not running in their favor. Diane was right about the clock. Willa returned to the farm Saturday evening to find a plain envelope on the porch. Inside was an unsigned typed offer at a number designed to be refused, followed by a paragraph about legal costs and personal liability. The purpose was not to purchase the farm. The purpose was to introduce the word liability into Willa's thinking and let it sit there. She put the envelope in the folder with everything else. On Monday, she drove to Nolan Reed's house, a small white ranch with a detached garage, converted into an office lined with labeled cardboard tubes of rolled survey maps. Nolan answered the door in a flannel shirt with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and said Travis had called ahead. She showed him Cole's map and the appendix. He unrolled 3 plat maps and spread them across his work table and oriented them against each other with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times. He traced the Carver north boundary and showed her where the original survey line matched the appendix description, exactly including the reference to the spring channel running east to west. Then he told her something he had kept to himself because, until now, there had been no one to tell it to who could use it. Cole had come to him before Nolan retired and shown him the same documents. Cole had suspected the mortgage addendum had been written broadly enough that someone might later argue it absorbed the appendix rights by implication. He had asked Nolan if that was possible under Illinois law. Nolan had told him to hire a lawyer and challenge the language before the loan progressed further. Cole had said he did not have the money for a lawyer and did not want to put a legal dispute on public record in a way that would flag the appendix's existence to the wrong people before he was ready. Nolan looked at his hands when he said the next part. Cole had told him he was not going to involve his daughter in this while she was still building her life somewhere else. He had been explicit. Willa was not to be pulled into a legal conflict in a town that had already decided who she was, not unless it became unavoidable. Nolan said he had thought at the time that Cole was making a mistake. He still thought that. But in 22 years of working county land records, he had never met a man more certain of what he was doing, even when what he was doing looked from the outside like surrender. Willa drove back to the farm in the dark and sat in the truck in the driveway for a long time before going in. The next morning, Travis called before 7. He had been out to the north fence line at first light to check a section of post near the east corner. He had found tire tracks in the soft ground along the fence's north side that did not match any vehicle he recognized. Wide base, deep tread equipment rather than a farm truck. At the northeast corner, 20 feet inside the fence line from the stone post, he had found 3 small ground disturbances in a line each about 6 inches across. With a faint smell of machine oil and a residue of gray dust he had seen before on drilling survey equipment, someone had run subsurface survey drilling on Carver land. On land that did not belong to them. On land they had not yet acquired. On land they had no legal right to survey. Willa called Diane. Diane said to photograph everything before the weather changed and not disturb anything until she had spoken with a specialist. The specialist was Tyler Boone, 44 years old, who had spent most of his career doing rural well and water system work for small farms across 3 counties. He drove out 2 days later with equipment in a worn canvas bag and spent a morning at the survey points Travis had marked with small flags. His findings were specific, and he described them in the plain language of a man who trusted facts to carry their own weight. The drilling points showed characteristics consistent with rotary percussion equipment used in subsurface water survey work. The disturbance depth suggested the survey had reached the water table level identified in the county's 1962 agricultural survey records, the same table referenced in Appendix B. Based on soil oxidation patterns, the work had been conducted within the last 8 weeks. The equipment that produced those marks was not equipment any farm operation would own. He also examined the capped well on the north parcel that the bank's default documentation had listed as non-functional. He removed the cap and took measurements inside the shaft. He found physical evidence of an obstruction in the lower drainage pipe, a compound material inconsistent with the original concrete construction, with a mineral composition and curing pattern, indicating it had been placed after the well's original installation. The well had not failed. It had been blocked. Willa stood at the edge of the north field while Tyler explained this and felt something settle inside her that had been unresolved for days, not satisfaction. Something colder and more functional than satisfaction. The specific clarity that arrives when a suspicion carried for some time is confirmed by someone with no stake in confirming it. She called Diane from the field. Diane said she needed one more piece before the foreclosure hearing, which had been scheduled for 16 days out. She needed to know whether any third party had formally accessed county records related to the Carver North parcel before the bank issued the default notice to the estate. Willa went back to the records office. What happened in that office on that afternoon was not something Ruth Odom had planned carefully or rehearsed in advance. It was the result of several days of sitting with a decision that had already been made, waiting for the moment that made the decision final. She had received a call from Hector 2 days earlier. He had asked her to come to the bank that afternoon. She had gone. He had 2 employees in the room when she arrived, positioned in the way people are positioned when a witness is desired. He had set a single sheet of paper on his desk, typed a formal declaration, stating that the classification discrepancy in the Carver parcel records was the result of a standard data entry error during system migration, consistent with dozens of similar errors across the county database, requiring no further investigation. He had asked her to sign it. Ruth had looked at the paper for a long time. Hector had filled the silence with a description of the review her husband's business loan would be subject to if she chose to make herself visible in a contested estate proceeding. He had not threatened. He had described. He had been precise and reasonable and had used the same tone he used for everything. The tone that presented options rather than demands that made coercion sound like administrative information. Ruth had picked up the pen She had looked at the paper again. She had set the pen down. She had said she could not sign it. Hector had said her name. She had stood up and walked out of the office and had not answered when he called her name a second time as she went through the door. She had driven to the county office and sat at her desk for the rest of that afternoon and the following morning, understanding fully what she had done and understanding that she was not going to undo it. When Willa came through the door 2 days later, Ruth printed a single page and set it on the counter. It was a records access log, a formal document request submitted by the legal representative of Prairie Vantage, LLC, for land records associated with parcel numbers matching the Carver North 40. The date of the request was 19 days before the bank had issued the default notice to Cole Carver's estate. Prairie Vantage had been searching for Appendix B before the foreclosure clock had officially started. They had known what they were looking for. They had needed to confirm its existence before deciding what to do about it. Willa looked at the page for a long time. Then she looked at Ruth. Ruth said her husband had a business loan at Ridgeline. She said she understood what handing over that piece of paper would cost. She said she was handing it over anyway because some things could not be unknowed once you knew them, and she had known this one for long enough. Willa thanked her. Ruth said she did not need thanks. She said the record needed to be what it actually was. That evening, Hector filed a procedural challenge to Willa's standing as a state representative on a narrow technical basis related to the timing of her probate filing. The challenge was thin, and Diane said it would not hold, but it froze Willa's access to certain bank records and forced Diane to spend 2 days on paperwork that existed only to create delay and cost. On the same day, Willa received word that Hector wished to meet privately before the formal hearing. She went. She brought her notebook. He received her in his office this time door, closed 2 chairs arranged across from his desk, in the configuration of a conversation between equals that was not between equals. He said he understood the difficulty of losing a parent. He said contested estate proceedings in Calhoun County typically ran 14 to 20 months. He placed a sheet of paper in front of her, a departure payment sufficient to cover her debts in Lexington and provide a starting point elsewhere, in exchange for a signed agreement not to contest the foreclosure and to release all claims against the estate's collateral assets as defined by the bank's documentation. He delivered it with the patience of a man who had never once been told no by someone who could afford to say it. Willa read the document. She noted the phrase collateral assets as defined by the bank's documentation. She noted there was no disclosure that certain assets might fall outside the bank's documentation. She noted that Hector had not once in any of their conversations mentioned Appendix B. She declined. His expression changed. Not dramatically. The small, controlled collapse of a surface performance when the performance has stopped serving its function. He said the bank would pursue all recovery costs, including fees that could attach personally to her. He said the hearing officer was a practical man who had seen this situation before. Then he asked whether she was certain she was not simply fighting for a man who had sent her away and allowed her to stay gone for 18 years. It landed exactly where he intended it to land. It found the part of her that was still raw and had not finished deciding what Cole Carver deserved from her in the matter of anger versus understanding. And it sat there, with the specific weight of a true thing used as a weapon. She said nothing. She stood and picked up her notebook and her bag and walked out of his office and through the lobby and out the glass doors without stopping. She sat in the parking lot for a long time. That night was the hardest. She sat in the kitchen with Cole's letter on the table, and the deed and the appendix and Tyler's preliminary report and Ruth's access log, and she came closer to walking away than she had at any point since driving into Dunmore. She was exhausted in a way that had moved past her body into something deeper. She was still angry at Cole with a legitimate anger at 18 years of Sunday phone calls that had substituted for an explanation he could have given her in person at any point during those 18 years if he had chosen to. She was also not entirely certain whether she was fighting for the land or fighting to prove something to a man she could no longer argue with directly, because he had died in a storage barn with a coffee mug on the floor beside him that had not broken when it fell. She picked up Cole's letter and read it again. Not the part about Appendix B, the other part. He had written that he had been wrong about the method. He had written it without decoration or qualification, in the blocky, careful handwriting of a man who did not often write things down, but understood the permanence of what he was setting to paper when he did. She folded the letter. She left it on the table. She went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about water moving through channels underground, finding its way along paths established decades before anyone alive had thought to interfere with them. And she fell asleep sometime after midnight. In the morning, Travis called to say the storage barn had been entered overnight. Side door forced. Padlock cut. Workbench drawers open. The wire basket on the shelf where Cole had kept paper files was on the floor and empty. Willa had moved all original documents 3 days after arriving. The deed, the appendix, the archive record, Cole's letter and map were in a waterproof envelope in the locked metal box in her truck. She had done it the way she did anything that mattered, without announcement and without waiting to be told. Hector had sent someone for the evidence that would tell him definitively whether the appendix had been found and whether Willa understood its significance. Travis installed a camera before he left that day, positioned at the side door and at the workbench. He said he had purchased it on the way over, which meant he had been thinking about it before she asked. Diane said to file a police report and document everything. She said a bank that sent someone into an estate storage barn was a bank that was afraid of what that barn contained. Afraid, she said, was a very useful condition for the opposing party to be in with 12 days left before a hearing. The 12 days moved the way time moves before something that cannot be undone, slowly in the individual hours and quickly in the aggregate, so that when Willa looked back across them later, she remembered not a sequence of days, but a series of weighted moments. Diane arrived Monday with 2 boxes of files and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting on both sides. She sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours and walked Willa through the structure of their argument and its order, and the reasoning behind that order. She did not use the word winning. She used the words sufficient and sustainable, and she explained the difference between a position that could be argued and a position that could hold under sustained pressure. Tyler completed his written technical report on Tuesday and sent it by courier. 41 pages of precise, undramatic language, the kind of writing that trusts facts to stand without amplification. He had documented the subsurface survey points, the obstruction in the well shaft, the hydrological viability of the spring channel, and the assessed current value of the water access rights using 3 comparable transactions in central Illinois agricultural counties from the past 6 years. The number he arrived at for the water rights alone was $2.3 million. The bank's foreclosure documentation had assessed the entire Carver farm, all 287 acres, including outbuildings and equipment, at $180,000. Willa read both numbers the same evening and sat with them. She did not find satisfaction in the distance between them. What she found was the clear, specific shape of what had been done to her father over the course of years. The slow, patient architecture of a plan that required Cole's water rights to appear worthless on paper, until the moment they could be absorbed without appearing to be absorbed. Travis came Wednesday and helped her move the remaining documents from the truck into a metal cabinet. He bolted to the back bedroom wall. When he was done, he said the town was talking. The version going around was that Willa had brought documents from Lexington that were not what she was representing them to be, constructed from legal language she had absorbed at her office job. It was being said at the co-op, and at the farm supply, and at the diner, in the careful, regretful tone people use when they want a rumor to carry the weight of reluctant truth. Willa said she had expected something like that. Travis said he knew. He also said that Rebecca Holt, who ran the diner on Main Street and had known Cole since 4th grade, had answered the rumor out loud at the counter that morning. She had said Cole Carver was many things, most of them difficult. But he was not a liar, and anyone constructing a story that required Cole to be a liar was constructing it because the accurate version made them uncomfortable. She had said it without raising her voice and gone back to work, and the diner had been quiet for a while afterward. On Thursday, Hector appeared before the County Board of Supervisors with Prairie Vantage's development proposal. He described the Carver property as a distressed agricultural site and positioned the acquisition as infrastructure investment and job creation. The Prairie Vantage representative used the language of county boards, the kind that makes extraction sound like opportunity. Willa stood at the back of the room without a seat because she had not been invited to speak. She watched the board members, and she watched the Prairie Vantage representative, and she thought about what the presence of a second law firm meant. A plan with sound legal footing did not need a county board endorsement 48 hours before the hearing. A plan with a gap in it did. She called Diane from the parking lot. Diane said she already knew about the second law firm retained from Springfield, specializing in administrative land proceedings. Hiring them this close to the hearing was not the behavior of a party with confidence in its existing documentation. Willa asked if they were ready. Diane said they had what they had, and what they had was sufficient. The night before the hearing, Willa went alone to the small family cemetery at the edge of the property where Elaine was buried, and where Cole had been placed 3 weeks ago beside her. 4 graves total going back to Earl's parents, bordered by a low stone wall. Cole had maintained with the same regularity he applied to everything structural on the farm. She stood at Cole's grave without speaking for a long time. The night was cold and clear, and the October stars were sharp the way they get in central Illinois, when the first real cold has pulled the humidity out of the air. When she finally spoke, it was not a speech, and it was not forgiveness in the complete sense, because she was honest enough to know that complete forgiveness was a process, and not a single moment, and that she was still somewhere in the middle of it. She told him she understood now why he had done what he did. She told him she did not think it had been the right decision, and she believed he had understood that too, in the years that followed, and that the letter in the tin box was the evidence of a man who had been carrying that knowledge for a long time, without knowing how to set it down. She told him the appendix was intact. She told him the stone post was still standing. She told him she had read the paperwork. Then she walked back to the farmhouse and reviewed her notes one more time, and went to bed at 10 o'clock, and lay awake until after midnight, and was at the courthouse by 7:30. The Calhoun County Courthouse hearing room seated 60 people, and was rarely more than a quarter full for administrative estate proceedings. When Willa arrived at 7:45, it was already 2/3 full. By the time the hearing officer called the session to order, it was as full as it had probably been since the last contested local election. She recognized most of the faces: the man who ran the co-op, the woman from the farm supply, several people from the diner, a board member who had sat in the front row at Thursday's Prairie Vantage presentation and had nodded at points that seemed designed to produce nodding. They had come because small towns come to things like this the way they come to funerals, to witness the conclusion of something that has been building, and to be present when the record is formally set. Most of them had come expecting to watch Willa Carver accept what they had always understood was inevitable. Hector sat at the respondents' table with Gerald Shore, the bank's attorney, and 2 Prairie Vantage representatives. 3 county board members were in the gallery rather than at the table, which meant they had shifted from participant to observer. That shift was readable. Hector arranged his papers with the composure of a man who had been in this room before and expected to leave it the same way. Gerald Shore presented the bank's case in 22 minutes. Cole had borrowed money. He had not maintained payments. He had allowed the property to decline. He had died without resolution. The heir had been offered a reasonable settlement and declined. The bank was exercising its contractual rights. He showed photographs of the damaged roof, the leaning fence, the capped well, the pale southern fields, and described the farm as an unviable agricultural asset, requiring remediation by a qualified development entity. It was clean and organized and designed to present itself as the obvious conclusion to a situation that had already been decided. Diane stood when Shore finished. She did not begin with the water rights. She began with a question. She asked the hearing officer to direct Gerald Shore to read aloud precisely and in full the collateral schedule attached to the Ridgeline Savings Bank operating loan held against the Carver estate. Shore read it. Farm operating parcel outbuildings, equipment inventory, and associated agricultural improvements. Diane asked him to read it again and to identify any language referencing water rights, spring access rights, or subsurface water table interests attached to the North 40 acres. Shore read it again. There was no such language. Diane placed the 1971 deed and Appendix B on the table as exhibits. She placed the state-level registration record beside them. She placed Nolan Reed's plat analysis beside that. Nolan was not a dramatic man, and he did not speak dramatically. He explained in plain sentences what the 1971 deed established, what Appendix B specified, what the boundary markers on the ground confirmed, and what the pre-digital county plat records showed. He said the separately constituted water rights recorded in Appendix B predated the operating mortgage by decades, and that, in 22 years of professional experience, he had never encountered a case in which a separately constituted subsurface interest was legally absorbed into a general farm operating mortgage without an explicit written conveyance naming those rights by their registered description. He said there was no such conveyance in the Carver mortgage file. He had reviewed the complete file. It was not there. A murmur moved through the gallery. Shore objected that historic deed language required interpretation in the context of the current debt instrument. Diane said she agreed, and that the interpretation the bank was relying upon required the hearing officer to read language into a collateral schedule that the schedule did not contain, which was not interpretation, but invention. Diane called Ruth Odom. Ruth walked to the front of the room with the steadiness of a person who has already absorbed the cost of what they are about to do and made peace with the terms. She confirmed that the 1971 deed had been registered with the correct classification on its paper original. She confirmed that the digital record carried an incorrect classification that made the document invisible in any standard ownership search. She confirmed the discrepancy had existed in the county system for at least 9 years. She confirmed the date of the Prairie Vantage Records access request. She confirmed the name on the request. She said all of it in a level voice without elaboration and returned to her seat. One of the Prairie Vantage representatives closed his folder. The board member who had been nodding along at Thursday's presentation raised his head and looked at the wall. Shore touched Hector's arm. Diane called Tyler Boone. Tyler described the subsurface survey marks, their depth and composition, their age based on oxidation patterns, the type of equipment that produced them. He described the obstruction in the well shaft, its material composition, his determination that it had been placed after the well's original construction. He described the hydrological viability of the spring channel and the water table access as currently functional. He said the bank's assessment of the water access as non-functional was inconsistent with the physical evidence present on the site. He presented the findings and let them stand without decoration. Then Diane placed two documents side by side on the table in front of the hearing officer. The first was the bank's foreclosure assessment of the Carver farm. $180,000 total. All 287 acres, all outbuildings, all equipment. The second was an internal Prairie Vantage project valuation document obtained through a public records request filed 6 days earlier against the company's registered development filings with the Illinois Commerce Commission. It was a document Prairie Vantage had been required to file as part of a preliminary infrastructure development application. It contained a line-item assessment of the water rights associated with the north parcel of the Carver property. Prairie Vantage had valued those water rights at $2.3 million. The room went very still. Diane did not raise her voice. She said the bank had declared the property nearly without value in its foreclosure documentation. She said a company in prior communication with the bank had simultaneously assessed the water rights alone at $2.3 million in a separate internal document filed with the state. She said the bank had pressed the estate's heir to sign a voluntary transfer, releasing all claims against the collateral assets as defined by the bank's documentation, without disclosing that certain assets of significant value might fall outside that definition. She said the physical evidence on the property showed subsurface survey work conducted by equipment consistent with Prairie Vantage operations within the 8-week period preceding the foreclosure deadline on land that had not yet been legally transferred to any party. She asked for an immediate injunction, halting all transfer proceedings pending an independent property review and an investigation into the circumstances of the subsurface survey work. Hector stood. He said Willa was using old paperwork to obstruct a legitimate debt recovery process. He said the water rights clause was a historical artifact with no material relevance to a modern secured lending instrument. He said grief led people to reach for documents they did not understand. Willa stood. She had not prepared a speech. She had 6 questions in a notebook and 3 weeks of reading in a farmhouse kitchen, and one thing she wanted said before the hearing officer made his ruling. She said she did not dispute that her father had debt. Cole Carver had borrowed money and had not fully repaid it, and she was not there to pretend otherwise. Then she looked at Hector directly across the room in front of the people who had come to watch her accept the conclusion that had been prepared for her. And she said one thing. She said if the property was worth $180,000, she would like someone to explain why Prairie Vantage had conducted subsurface survey drilling on land they did not yet own at their own operational cost, 6 weeks before the foreclosure was complete, in order to confirm the location of a water table they had valued internally at $2.3 million. She said it once clearly without raising her voice, without waiting for an answer. The room was completely silent. Diane reported to the hearing officer that a break-in had occurred at the estate's storage barn during the contested period, documented by physical evidence and camera recording with files removed from the property. She submitted the police report and the camera footage log as exhibits. She did not name Hector. She did not need to. The Prairie Vantage representative who had closed his folder stood and said quietly to his colleague that they needed to step outside. A moment passed before the colleague stood as well. The board member who had come as a Prairie Vantage supporter looked at Gerald Shore. Shore was looking at his papers. He was not looking at Hector. The hearing officer reviewed the exhibits for 11 minutes. Then he issued a temporary halt on all foreclosure transfer proceedings, pending an independent assessment of the property description, the legal status of Appendix B, and the accuracy of the bank's collateral valuation. He barred Ridgeline Savings Bank from conveying any portion of the Carver property to any third party until the assessment was complete. He noted that the subsurface survey evidence would be referred to the State Attorney General's office for review under the Illinois Trespass to Real Property statute. Hector left without speaking to anyone. He did not look at Willa. He walked to the door, concentrating on nothing other than the mechanics of walking, and then he was gone. The room did not erupt. No one applauded. What happened was quieter and in some ways more complete than noise. The room released the tension that had been building in it across the duration of the hearing. The way a structure settles when a load that has been bearing down on it for a long time is finally set aside. People began talking in low voices. Several looked at Willa and then looked at their hands. The board member gathered his jacket from the seat beside him and left without making eye contact with anyone at the respondents' table. Diane stood beside Willa and said nothing for a moment. Then she said they had a great deal of work still ahead, and that the injunction was a beginning and not a conclusion. Willa said she knew. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Ridgeline Savings Bank's parent organization initiated a review of Hector Vance's conduct in the Carver estate proceedings. He was placed on administrative leave from the account and reassigned to a role with no authority over active foreclosure transactions. His standing in Dunmore, the quiet authority of a man who had operated without visible challenge for a decade, did not recover. Authority of that kind, once examined in a room full of witnesses, rarely reassembles itself. Prairie Vantage, LLC withdrew its acquisition proposal without public explanation. The infrastructure development application filed with the Illinois Commerce Commission was placed on administrative hold, pending the Attorney General's review. The county board members who had attended Thursday's presentation began asking questions about other Prairie Vantage proposals in the county, and the answers that came back were not reassuring. The company had not been interested in agricultural remediation. They had been interested in water, specifically in controlling the water access corridor that ran through the northern boundary of the county, of which the Carver North 40 represented the critical anchor point. The land they had called worthless was the only reason they had ever wanted it. Ruth Odom's husband's business loan was reviewed as part of the broader audit that followed the internal investigation. The preferential terms attached to Hector's discretionary oversight were removed. The loan was reissued under the bank's standard commercial lending conditions. Ruth did not receive anything she would have described as a reward. Her husband did not lose his business. She had understood when she handed over the access log what she was trading, and the trade had been made clearly, and without a guarantee of how it would resolve. That was what integrity looked like in a county where it cost something to have it. Willa negotiated a restructured repayment arrangement with the bank's new oversight team over 6 weeks of careful conversations that Diane handled with the same directness she applied to everything. The terms were not easy. The debt was real and had to be addressed on its own terms, and there was no version of events in which money Cole had borrowed simply ceased to exist because justice had been served in another column. She sold 2 pieces of older equipment and arranged a short-term field lease on the south parcel to a neighboring farm operation. While she established the property's working baseline, she was negotiating from a position. That was the difference from the alternative, not from surrender. Tyler Boone returned to the north parcel in December with a small crew to clear the drainage pipe and restore the connection to the spring channel. In the early afternoon, on a cold, clear day with frost still on the ground, in the shadows of the fence line, the first water moved through the restored passage. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just a thin and steady current working its way back through a channel that had been closed for years, moving with the unhurried persistence of water that has always known where it is going and has been waiting for the obstruction to be removed. Willa stood at the edge of the field and watched it for a long time without speaking. She named the North 40 Elaine Field. She did not tell anyone that day. She went alone to the northeast corner where the stone post stood in the cold ground. EC 1971. Earl Carver's initials and the year he had understood that some things needed to be protected before they needed to be defended. She stood beside it for a moment. Then she walked back to the farm and went to work. On a January morning with snow on the ground and the sky the white-gray of paper held up to a window, Travis helped her remount the painted wooden farm sign at the gate of the driveway. It had been stored in the back of the storage barn since before she could remember. Carver Farm white letters on dark green paint cracked in several places and faded to a shade that was more suggestion than statement. Not a beautiful object, an object that had survived decades in a barn and still held its shape and still said what it had always said. Travis held the post steady while Willa drove the mounting bolts home. When it was done, he stepped back and looked at it and said, "It had been a while since that was up." She said yes. He said Cole would have had something to say about the paint condition. She said he absolutely would have. They stood in the cold with the sign above them and the snow on the fields on both sides of the lane, and then Travis said he needed to get back to the electrical work in the storage barn and walked off with his hands in his coat pockets, which was precisely the right thing to do, and exactly what Travis Holt had always done. Several months after the hearing, Diane drove down from Lexington to accompany Willa to Ridgeline Savings Bank to sign the restructured loan agreement. The branch director who received them was a different man, younger and more careful, who spoke in the straightforward language of a person conducting professional business without subtext or management. When the paperwork was complete and they walked out to the parking lot, Diane was quiet for half a block. Then she said she had sat in a lot of rooms like that with a lot of clients over 17 years, and that most of the people who walked into a room like that without money or established connections or a family name that carried institutional weight did not walk back out holding what Willa was holding. Willa said she understood. Diane said she knew she did. Then she got in her car and drove north toward Lexington. The South fields were not dead. They had been cut off. The drainage restoration on the north parcel had begun to affect the subsurface moisture in the southern sections within the first spring season, in ways that were small and not yet productive, but were measurable and pointed consistently in the right direction. The land had been called lost because it had been useful to certain people for it to appear lost. The water had always been there, moving through channels underground that Earl Carver had mapped and protected, and passed to a son who had kept the knowledge and a granddaughter who had come back to use it. Willa Carver had arrived in Dunmore in October with mud on her boots from a farm she had not stood on in years, a notebook with 6 questions and a photocopy of a document that most people handed off without reading. She had not won quickly. She had not won without cost. She had spent money she did not have comfortably, and weeks she could not recover, and a portion of herself she had needed to spend on understanding a man who had made his most important decisions alone and in silence, and had left the explanation in a tin box under a floorboard in a storage barn at the edge of a field in central Illinois. What she had done was read the paperwork. She had read it the way her father had asked her to read it, more carefully than the people who had spent years making certain it would not be found. And Appendix B had said what it had always said, in the plain, patient language of a document that does not require anyone to believe in it in order to be true, waiting in a sleeve of waxed paper under a barn floor for the person who would eventually come back and know what to do with it. In 1971, a man named Earl Carver had sat across from a notary in a county courthouse and asked for a separate page to be added to a deed, because he understood that water was worth more than the ground above it, and that protecting a thing and defending a thing were not the same problem and could not be solved with the same instrument. He had filed that page at the state level, in a system that would outlast him. And he had told his son what it meant. And his son had kept it through 3 decades of pressure and silence and Sunday phone calls. And his granddaughter had found it in October, in a box that was not locked. It had never needed to be locked. The lock was the knowledge of where to look. The knowledge had always been hers.